of this CodeLab. In the previous part, we used the @state and @binding property wrappers to define a value type as a source of truth for triggering updates in our view hierarchy. In this part, we're going to use a reference type, and when we added the @state attribute to a property to identify it as a source of truth, the @state property wrappers only works for value types such as structs and enumerations. SwiftUI declares property wrappers that declare a reference type as a source of truth, @observed object, @state object, and @environment object. So to use those property wrappers, we need to make our class observable. So we can make a class observable by adopting the observable object protocol. We can choose the properties that need to trigger a UI update and add the published attribute to each of those properties. So let's create a Scrum Timer class and make that a observable object. So the Scrum Timer object is going to be an observable object and has 3 properties. So let's go ahead and declare those. The first property is active speaker, and it's initialized as an empty string. The second property is a seconds elapsed. It's set to 0 initially. And the third property is called seconds remaining. So the class declares these properties and they're going to update frequently. So we need to notify any observers when the values of these properties change. So to monitor the observable object, we can add the observed object or the state object or the environment object attribute. And a view property declared with these wrappers creates a new source of truth for our view hierarchy. So the @state object wrapper creates an observable object inside a view. So the system initializes the object when creating the view and keeps the object available to use in that view or in other views. So our meeting view has a property called Scrum Timer, and it's set to be an @state object. So in our meeting view, we can go ahead and add an @state object and have it initialized using the default initializer for Scrum Timer. We use the @observed object property wrapper to indicate that we passed an object from another view. Because we create the object in another view, we don't provide an initial value for an observed object. So in this case, we have a struct which is a child view, and it has a property called timer, but that property or that timer object is going to be an @observed object. So let's go ahead and create a child view. And the child view is going to be an @observed object with the property Scrum Timer of type Scrum Timer. Now we can pass an instance of the observable object to the view's initializer. So when we initialize child view, we can pass Scrum timer into the meeting view. So let's go ahead and do that. In our meeting view, we can create a child view inside the vStack and pass Scrum timer in as the observed object, and let's hit refresh here. Let's try to build the project. So it's saying the preview is failing, so we could add timer and initialize it as Scrum timer with the default in it. So let's see what that looks like. And meeting view, when we refresh it, is like that. So instead of passing objects into individual views, we can place objects into the environment. The environment object view modifier places an object in the environment in a parent view, and any ancestor view can then access the object without an explicit injection chain. So in our parent view, we could as well place the Scrum timer by calling the modifier environment object on the child view. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create a parent view. And instead of passing the timer into the child view constructor, we can call environment object on the child view and thus pass the Scrum timer object in. So let's create a state object here, and we call that Scrum timer, and we initialize it as Scrum timer, and then we have a vStack and add the child view inside the vStack and pass the environment object Scrum timer into the child view. In this case, we need to modify the child view to accept the environment object as a property. So in our child view, we changed this to @environment object, and in here as well we can set the environment object to be the Scrum timer instance. And in this case, we would also set Scrum timer as the environment object. So there's a section called managing model data in our app, and that one uses environment object. So we can go through that in the next part. Now, once we've had this, we can now use what we learned here for the next part. So we're going to use what we learned here to respond to events. So we'll see you in the next part. Thanks for watching.